Recognized for your questions.
Well, thanks, Chair Peters and Ranking Member Paul, for holding this hearing. Thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today. Dr. Koblenz, one of the areas of inquiry in this hearing is obviously whether research funded by the United States government has appropriate oversight. However, private companies, universities, and independent research institutions are also engaging in cutting-edge research. While their research has the potential to cure diseases and boost our economy, unless they accept federal funding, there is very little federal oversight to ensure that private labs are engaged in safe and ethical research. What safety procedures are in place for research facilities that don't receive government funding? And are there oversight measures that either government or independent authorities should put in place to monitor work at these labs, including labs working on gene synthesis?
Thank you, Senator. The oversight of privately funded research is much less than that of federally funded research in terms of both biosafety, biosecurity, and dual-use research oversight. What we've seen in the area of dual-use research oversight, for example, in the most recent policy that the Biden administration released, only applies to federally funded research. However, there is the ability for federal agencies to require their grant recipients to apply this new policy to all research, including that's privately funded, but that requires special authority that some agencies may have, but others would need legislation to give them that ability. That wouldn't cover research that's only conducted by privately funded entities, but it would expand the scope of research that is. In order to expand the scope of oversight to all privately funded research would require legislative action. Along the lines of the proposal I included in my written statement for the establishment of a national biorisk management agency, that would have authority over biosafety, biosecurity, and dual-use research oversight, regardless of source of funding. Okay. Because at the end of the day, it shouldn't matter where the funding comes from in terms of making sure this research is being done safely, securely, and responsibly.
Thank you for that. Another question to you, Dr. Koblenz. We've heard a great deal about the risks of certain types of research involving dangerous pathogens and the need for robust oversight on the type of experiments that are performed. We've heard less about the potential risks from researchers performing off-the-books or unsupervised experiments that may be risky or unethical. How serious are the risks posed by malicious or unethical insiders, and are the United States and international authorities equipped to sufficiently mitigate these risks?
Following the revelations that Bruce Ivins was responsible for the anthrax litter attacks, which happened in 2009, the United States took a much stronger stance on trying to prevent insider threats at facilities. And so the Federal Select Agent Program, which focused on biosecurity, included a number of measures to try and better monitor science who have access to pathogens in terms of ensuring that they remain, they do not become security risks. Right. That kind of efforts to mitigate insider threats does not exist in the side of the dual-use research oversight. There is a lot of emphasis on self-governance by research institutions and by PIs to basically govern their own labs and make sure that work is not being done that is, as you said, off the books or is any way unethical. But so it is really at this point the onus is on research institutions to make sure that the work activity being done on their facilities is in compliance with all relevant laws and regulations. So that is an area that is currently a gap in our oversight of this kind of research.
Okay, thank you. One more question for you. When it comes to biosecurity, the U.S. domestic security is obviously tied to international efforts. What happens halfway across the globe can clearly impact us in the United States. Doctor, you're involved in the Global Biolabs Initiative, which is an organization that tracks all the highest biosecurity level labs in the world. Are there labs that are of particular concern? And if so, what action should Congress and the executive branch take to improve their safety and thus our national security?
As we documented in our report last year on global biolabs, there's been a building boom in BSL-4 labs since the start of the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And so there are a number of countries that are now building their first BSL-4 labs that don't actually have their national biosafety and biosecurity legislation regulations in place. And so countries like the Philippines, Kazakhstan, Saudi Arabia are trying to construct facilities, but they don't yet have the regulatory infrastructure that they need to make sure those labs can be operated safely, securely, and responsibly. In addition, countries like China and India, who already operate BSL-4 labs, are planning on building additional labs as well. And so in all of these cases, there's a need for making sure that these, at the national level, that the right biorisk management policies are in place, and then at the laboratory level, that these policies are being followed properly. And there are a number of measures that both the U.S. and internationally through WHO and other entities could take to try and ensure that these regulations are in place and are being followed properly.
And can you elaborate on what those steps would be?
Sure. So there is a international standard for biorisk management that creates a framework for how do you ensure that safety and security is prioritized across your laboratory and your research enterprise. It's called ISO 35001. It was negotiated end of 2019, but has not been widely adopted yet by labs around the world. Having that kind of international standard is very useful because it provides the best practices for biosafety and biosecurity, and it includes a process by which you need to document how you're complying with that standard. That documentation then becomes available for audit in the event that you need to have any kind of investigation by local, national, international authorities to ensure that the facility is operating properly and is operating safely and securely. So that kind of standard provides an international metric for measuring whether or not a lab is operating to the international standards that we would hope they would be.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.